to actually see those pages coming out of the machine, it was such a thrill to see your work finally properly in print, in a beautiful book, on the paper you wanted, on the stock you wanted, in this old kind of printing factory. I mean, I'd never been on print before in this way, and I had to sign off every page that they printed out.
If you lead an interesting life, good pictures will happen.
Oh, nice. You might well be my sexiest sounding guest.
Go somewhere you've never been before and take a camera.
We had this gorgeous Mediterranean light just flowing in.
Which Asda were you in?
Dartford.
Very nice.
Your first 10,000 pictures of your worst.
Let's sit down, let's have a cup of tea.
Welcome to the show. Ladies and gentlemen, a very warm welcome to another episode of the Standout Photography Show with me, Matthew Walker, where, as always, it is my honour and privilege to interview the finest working photographers in the world to unpack their systems, workflows, and find out what enables them to perform consistently at the very top of their profession. Before I introduce our guest today, would you like to maximise your photography in one short email? Like you, my goal is to improve. So, every Friday you can receive a handful of bullet points highlighting things I've discovered from speaking with the best photographers in the world. It could be software recommendations, articles, book quotes, videos we've shared. All are designed to challenge you, expand your photography knowledge, and keep you ahead of the competition. It has become extremely popular since we started this podcast. It's completely free, very short, won't clog up your inbox, but could make a big difference to your photography. If you'd like to receive that, head on over to thestandoutcompany.com/podcast. That is thestandoutcompany.com/podcast. Drop in your email and you'll receive the very next issue. Similarly, this show is all about you. Is there a world-class photographer that you want to hear in conversation? If so, let us know at the same place, thestandoutcompany.com/podcast, and we'll do all we can to get them on the show for you. For now, thank you as always for tuning in. Let me introduce today's guest. My guest today is Alys Tomlinson. That is at Alys Tomlinson on Instagram and alystomlinson.co.uk on the World Wide Webs. That is Alys, spelt the Welsh way, A-L-Y-S. Alys is an editorial and fine art documentary photographer based in London. Having grown up in Brighton, Alys went on to study English literature and communications at the University of Leeds. After graduating, she moved to New York for a year, where she was given her first commission for Time Out, before coming back to London to study photography at Central St Martin's College of Art and Design. She has recently completed a part-time MA in Anthropology of Travel, Tourism and Pilgrimage at the University of London, which ties in with her long-term personal project about pilgrimage. Alys combines commissioned work for editorial, design and advertising clients with personal work which she publishes and exhibits. In 2018, Alys was named Sony World Photography Awards Photographer of the Year. Alys has a rare ability to navigate a career as a commercial photographer and that of a fine art photographer. During our conversation, we talk in depth about how she has achieved this, where she looks for inspiration for her personal projects, problem solving, and the smaller personal projects that led her to becoming the Sony World Photography Awards Photographer of the Year. Without further ado, please enjoy my conversation with the wonderful Alys Tomlinson. Alys Tomlinson, welcome to the show.
Hello, thank you for having me.
Absolute pleasure. So, where in the world am I speaking to you today?
I am in North London. I actually live slightly strangely within the Arsenal Emirates football complex. So I look out, I'm right in the stadium complex. So, yeah, I basically live in a football stadium. So,
very nice.
If anyone's an Arsenal fan, then...
a lovely part of London. You've got is it the Hen and Chickens that are down the road from you?
Yeah, that's at Highbury Corner. Yeah, but that's the pub that's got the theatre upstairs.
Yes, that's the one.
Yeah, I'm in Islington, Highbury, Holloway, Finsbury Park, that kind of area.
I know it very, very well indeed. Now, for anyone that's unfamiliar with your work, would you mind just describing yourself and your work as a photographer?
Sure. I mean, I always found this a little bit tricky. I guess I would describe myself up until recently, I was very much a commercial photographer, making a living from assignments and commercial work for editorial, like magazines, advertising a bit, and a lot of design agency work. But I suppose I've always really wanted to concentrate on my own projects. And it's just been in the last 5 years, really, that I've made a very conscious decision to move towards focusing on my own projects. So I guess now I would describe myself as a editorial, but also documentary fine art photographer, which sounds a little bit poncy. My career's kind of shifted and it's gone in a slightly different direction, which is great because it's a direction I really want to go in. But I always find it a little bit difficult to describe myself because on the one hand, I'm a photographic artist. On the other hand, I feel like I'm a working commercial photographer. So I'm really trying to juggle the two of them.
Well, that was one of the things that fascinated me about you when I started looking into your work and doing my research. But we'll come on to how those two channels interlink a little bit later on. It may sound like a really daft question, but why photography? And I know that is extremely broad, but for me, as an example, I think you can never recreate the same moment twice. If you capture it, it's there forever. And if you miss it, it's gone forever. And for me, I guess it's as simple as that. So why photography?
That is a good question. It's actually quite a difficult question to answer, I think. For me, for instance, growing up, I was always really interested in film and literature and visual imagery. Like I would like going to galleries and things like that. And I was always very much an observer. So I would spend hours just kind of looking at people. I think I was quite quiet as a child and quite insular in some ways, but I spent a lot of time just looking and observing what was going around me. But I wasn't kind of arty in that I was terrible at GCSE art, and I don't even think I did GCSE art. I was terrible at art classes at school. I wasn't good at painting or drawing. I didn't feel I had any natural ability there, but I was fairly academic, but not that academic. But I suppose with photography, I feel that it merges my kind of rational side and a science really with my creative and artistic side. So it combines the two of them. And also there is something about the kind of visual language of photography that just connects with me in a way that nothing else does really. And like you say, in terms of capturing that moment, there's also an excitement there in terms of not quite knowing what you're going to get, particularly when you shoot on film, which I do a lot. So for me, there's that anticipation that is part of the magic of photography, really.
You've been a photographer for, and correct me if I'm wrong, a working photographer for about 20 years, is that correct?
God, yeah. I feel really old now, but yeah, probably.
No,
it
not
probably
at
is
all.
About 20, yeah.
I'm interested, what jobs did you do, if any, in fact, before you became a full-time photographer? Because I think they can be very important, and quite often they get overlooked because they're just the jobs you did before you became a photographer. But in some respects, you can learn some great life lessons in those jobs and some disciplines that you don't perhaps realise until after the fact. Mm-hmm. So what jobs did you do prior to becoming a photographer?
So because I didn't know this was really what I wanted to pursue till I was perhaps in my kind of early 20s actually, but it wasn't always a very clear career path for me. So I've never actually, I don't know if it's shameful to say, I've never actually had a full-time job, like in terms of kind of commuting 9 to 5. So I have nothing about kind of office life or office culture, and I've never had colleagues really, which some people who work in offices I think are quite envious of. But for me, it's also, it can be quite an isolating existence being a photographer. But in terms of jobs I did beforehand, so I took a year out when I was at university and I did all sorts of work experience. I thought I might want to be a journalist, so I did some writing. Work experience, I ended up working at Marie Claire as a beauty assistant. I thought I might want to go into film at one point, so I did an internship at a film production company, and then I worked in a bar part-time when I was starting the photography. I worked as a popcorn handler, if you like, at MGM Cinema. I mean, really not a kind of glamorous array of jobs here, but I always think about those jobs that it does, like you say, it teaches you discipline. You've got to be organised, you've got to be punctual, you've got to be reliable, and they are all qualities that you absolutely need if you're going to work in photography, whether it's in the commercial world or the art world. So they were never jobs kind of for life, and they were never jobs that I really wanted to do for that long, but they definitely formed a part of who I am, I suppose. But I never had I've never really had a full-time job. I did lots of different things because I kind of knew from my early 20s that photography was what I wanted to pursue, but it was obviously very difficult to just launch yourself as a photographer overnight. I did some assisting as well, which a lot of photographers do, but I was never a full-time assistant. So I assisted an interiors photographer for a bit, a still life photographer for a bit. So yeah, a real mix of things, really.
How did you get those assisting jobs initially? Did you write to people? Did you email? Did you knock on doors? How did that work?
I think at that point the AOP was still around. I mean, it's been around a long time. So they had a kind of assistants list that you could join. So it was like a database of assistants. They still have it, in fact. That's the Association of Photographers. And I put myself on that list, so I would occasionally get phone calls, and then I would contact photographers whose work I really liked. But I think I was a little bit, I was a bit nervous about it, and I wasn't as bold as I should have been. And if they didn't get back to me, I'd just kind of leave it and think, oh, well, they're not interested. And actually, looking back, there are other photographers I really would have liked to have worked for and assisted, but I think I would have had to be much more persistent in terms of kind of pursuing them, if you like. Because obviously they get so many people wanting to assist them. So it was a case of, it's quite easy to find most photographers' details, but I would send them an email. I wasn't bold enough to just call them out of the blue, although I think that's probably a perfectly fine thing to do, because you might, catch someone if it's the right time, you can actually have a conversation with them. It's not as easy to ignore as an email. And I remember going for an interview at one point with Hannah Starkey, who's an art photographer, who I'm actually very good friends with now. And but I didn't get the job because she was working entirely on large format at that point, film. And at that point, I'd never loaded a 5:4 film. So she needed someone very technical, and I really wasn't that technical at that point. I still don't feel I am really. But so it was a kind of mix of things. So I didn't assist loads full time. I did studio assisting for a bit as well, which is hard work because you're working really long hours. So you're doing everything from opening up the studio to kind of making the tea, making sure everything's all right, like making sure everything's really clean, that the studio's in a really good state, meeting the client. So I think full-time studio assistants I have a lot of respect for. It's really, really hard work. But obviously you're meeting photographers the whole time because different shoots are taking place on different days within that one studio. So it's a great way to kind of begin to network and see how different photographers work as well in terms of their styles in the studio.
It's interesting then that you said you'd approached Hannah and you didn't have the skills that perhaps she required. You do have them now, very much so. Where did you go to learn that world of film? So
I started in photography before digital was even a thing. So when at university, for instance, I did a Sitting Guilds evening course, which was all black and white photography. So that was all working in the darkroom, processing our own films. My dad gave me an old Pentax SLR, which was a film camera. So that was my first camera. And then the only time I actually studied photography kind of formally after the Sitting Guilds course was I went to Central St Martin's College of Art in London, part of the University of the Arts, and I did a postgraduate certificate in professional photography, I think it was called, which was a year's course. And that was really when I really kind of honed my skills, I suppose, because obviously when you're a student, you've got this incredible opportunity to just use really as much equipment as you want, not having to, you paid huge fees already, but at no extra cost, if you like. And it's like this kind of treasure trove that you can dive into. So at that point, I started experimenting with different formats, but it was still all film photography. And it's only been recently, part of the reason I kind of revisited personal work, if you like, is because I was taking so many images on commercial assignments, which is all digital, nearly all digital. And, often taking 1,000 images a day and then having to go through them all. And I just wanted to slow everything down. And that's really why I went back to the 5:4. But in terms of technical stuff, it's funny, I still don't think of myself as that technical, but I know how to use what I have well, if that makes sense. If you threw me in a studio with a camera system I've never used and a load of lights I've never used, I would be a bit clueless. But I've got my own setup that I know well, and I know my own equipment well, and I feel comfortable working that way. But I'm certainly not a kind of technician in that you could give me, any cameras or lights and I'll be able to kind of set them up fantastically in a short space of time. I spent a lot of time even watching, YouTube videos of how to use the movements on my camera and reading manuals and the kind of boring stuff.
I think it's interesting that you said when you're at university there's so many things at your disposal. One of them, for me, we had a whole sound booth, which I think I went into twice in 3 years.
I know.
And those things, if anyone is at university...
You don't realise at the time how valuable having that access is and how expensive it is afterwards if you were to hire it commercially.
Yes, and I think because it's there as well, it's always there. It's a bit like the London Eye. You don't go on it because it's there. Yeah. If you're at university, use your equipment because that's what it's there for. We've touched a little bit on your commercial work and your personal work. How do you've got such a large body of work and you've taken so many wonderful images over the years. How do you whittle that down on your website? Because with all of the work that you've got and all of the archive work, how do you whittle that down to potentially 50, 60 images that you display on your website?
It's quite hard. I'm still not really sure about the best route for my website, if you like, because when I started focusing more on my personal projects and my artistic work, if you like, I feel that there's a really strong difference between my personal work and my commission work and commercial work. There's some photographers who are able to really merge the two. Like I'm thinking of people like Jamie Hawksworth, I've just been looking at his work recently because he's just done the key workers for the cover of Vogue. Now, if you look at his work, his commission work for advertising and magazines and his personal work, he did a whole project about of portraits of people at a bus station in Preston, which doesn't sound like it would translate to the pages of Vogue, but actually the style he's got, which is it's very beautiful portraiture, but in a kind of documentary style, that's what the fashion world is looking at the moment. So his work, there's not a kind of division really between the personal projects he does and his commercial work. Whereas me, there's a distinct division in that, as I said, nearly all my commission work is on digital, and that's really to do with client expectation. Like there has been jobs where I've tried to push to shoot it on film because I think it will be more interesting and different in terms of the results, but they're a bit uncomfortable with that, or they don't trust that process, or they want the images too quickly for me to be able to do that, or they don't have the budget, even though you could argue that they should be paying they should be obviously paying a kind of fee for the post-production, which would have covered the film cost anyway. So, it's kind of boring, that stuff. But for me, my website, at the moment, I try and keep it quite simple. So I've got a clear division or clear categories for my personal work. I think I have my personal work under projects, and then I have my commission work. But it doesn't always sit that comfortably with me. And I have actually thought about just taking my commercial work off altogether. And when I talked with the gallery who represent me, I was a little worried about that, because I kind of said, people are going to go onto my website, and I've done this whole project which has done quite well in the art world, and it's black and white large format, and then you suddenly got these kind of lifestyle pictures of like grinning children in a playground, and they jar a little bit for me. But they just said to me, they were fine. They said, that's how you make your money, so why pretend that you don't make your money that way? And actually there's a lot of value to be had in that you're kind of a working photographer as well. So it's a bit tricky. I've kind of thought about maybe redesigning my website and just having a kind of artistic website. Some photographers even go as far as to have a pseudonym for their commercial work, which I'm definitely not going to do. But some photographers are much more careful about it in terms of their own branding, I suppose. But for me, everything sits together at the moment, but it is kind of categorized. But I feel also I'm in a very different kind of mindset when I'm working on my personal projects. So for me, the two are quite separate, actually.
And if I'm not mistaken, for your commercial work, that's purely your business, isn't it? You don't have someone that represents you for commercial work.
Yeah, I don't have a commercial agent, although I have been talking to a couple. But I think I just don't really, because it's not the direction I really want to go in. I don't have it in me to really push for a commercial agent, although I think kind of logically it would be a good thing, because if I can get 1 or 2 ad campaigns a year, for instance, which who knows if I would, but if I could, that could then fund very nicely my personal projects. So, some photographers manage to do that very well. So I don't have a commercial agent, although I'm talking to a couple. So there's potentially something there. But I have a gallery who represent my artistic work, if you like, who represent my personal work. So they're like the equivalent of a commercial agent. They don't call themselves an agent, but they essentially are representation, but in the art world.
With your commercial work, what does the journey look like from the moment an inquiry comes in to you potentially starting work on that job? For example, I will often respond to an inquiry with a breakdown of what we can do and how we can deliver their concept and in what time frame, but I will also include examples of 2 previous contrasting jobs to try and open up a dialogue and say, what do you like and what don't you like about these outcomes? Because what I've noticed is you start to build a rapport with the client, and it potentially gives them options which they haven't maybe previously explored.
I feel I'm a little different in that I don't really give them a choice. I'm a bit more like, this is my style, and you can see my style from my website. And I'm willing to be flexible, of course. But I think if they want someone who does something, or they want a completely different style, that's not what I do. So, for instance, I've got a good friend called Julia Fullerton-Batten, who is one of the kind of leading advertising photographers and one of the few female photographers to be very kind of well respected. She gets loads of work in the advertising world. Now, if someone came up to me and said, "Oh, we've got this campaign and we'd like you to do it, but we want it to look kind of like in the style of Julia's photographs," I think I'd just say no, because I probably could if I hired a big enough crew of assistants and lighting technicians to help me, but that's not the way I work. Even in my commercial work, a lot of it it's kind of lifestyle and it's documentary and it's quite natural, and a lot of it is about my ability to build relationships with people. So, I would be silly to turn down work, but at the same time, I can see where my limits are in terms of being capable, and I want to be really confident going into jobs. So I don't tend to say, this is one way of doing it and this is another way of doing it, and what would you prefer? I will sometimes, depending on the job, like a lot of agencies now want you to submit a treatment. So if you're obviously submitting a treatment, that's a very clear idea of the mood and tone and the look of the images. So it's almost like submitting a mood board and then text that describes what you're doing. But I feel really if clients are coming to me or to any photographer, it's because they've got something distinctive about them. And that's what makes them special, and that's what makes them the only people who can really do that job well. So, but I also think I'm pretty terrible in terms of business. So I suppose it's difficult because I'm not really pursuing the commercial side of things so much anymore. So, for instance, I've got a printed portfolio, but I can't remember the last time I actually went around to art buyers and saw them with my portfolio. So a little bit of passion in me has gone for that type of work now. Although saying that, when a job goes well, a commercial job goes well, it's a great feeling if you've got a crew and everything comes together and the client loves the images and there's a really good kind of atmosphere on set, then that's great. And also working in a team and collaborating is fantastic, because my personal work is nearly always me on my own, or occasionally with an assistant. But it's, it can be quite lonely and isolating at times. So I like the kind of camaraderie, if you like, and the support system you have when you're working with an agency and with a team. But for me, I've kind of given you a very long answer. But I suppose, if someone's making initial contact, I'll sometimes, for instance, if occasionally you get a client who says, "Oh, I want this, this and this," and have you got any more work? And you're thinking, I've got so much work on my website. Can't you see that, I can do this job quite well? But sometimes I will have to trawl through my archives and I'll put together, if it's a job I really want to do, then I'll put together a PDF, especially for that job, that I'll then send to the client, that is very much focused on the types of images that they want to see, because I can tell sometimes that they just can't be bothered to look through a lot of my website. And perhaps I've got too much on my website. I don't know. It's something that I'm kind of always struggling with a bit, because there's no easy answer. I think if you start getting into hundreds of images on a website, it can get confusing and it's just too much, and clients are not going to spend the time trawling through a website for hours and hours. So obviously you just want the kind of strongest work up there, but also the work that shows your depth and breadth, if you like. So, but that shows a distinct style as well. I think that is important.
I like the very direct approach of just saying no to something if you don't feel it's a good fit for you, because it's so important, because you could have an incredible career, but your career could almost be defined by other people in terms of inquiries and clients coming to you because they want something from you, and then that ultimately decides what your work looks like. So I think it's super important to be able to say no. And I think it's one of the things I sent to you. Do you have any filters, for example, that allow you to say no?
Yeah, I think a lot of that comes with confidence. When I was first starting out, I took anything that was thrown at me because I was just happy to be working. And I was happy for someone to pay me to take photographs. I didn't care if it was 50 quid, you know. I remember going to see Time Out and they said the day rate was £200. And I was like, wow, you know, which now I wouldn't work for that. But at the time, I was incredibly enthusiastic and I wanted to do anything that I could that was at all photography related. Now, I mean, it's difficult. I'm not getting people knocking on my door every day offering me a lot of money, you know, at all. But what I have got is the confidence to be able to say no if I don't think it's, for instance, a fair price. I've had kind of a couple of battles, if you like, with agencies and art buyers who, for instance, have initially not put up any female photographers for a job. And that's actually something in the industry now that some agencies are taking. It sounds a bit over the top, like a pledge, but they are pledging essentially that if they get a big ad job in, one of the 3 photographers they're putting forward must be a female. Because it's not that there is a lack of very talented female photographers in the advertising world or in the photography world. It's just that for some reason they're not getting seen and they're not being given a platform. So I think things like that are really, really helpful. So I'm not afraid to kind of speak my mind, I guess. But a lot of that, again, is down to confidence and experience. There's no way I would have challenged an art buyer or a designer or anyone who I felt was in that kind of position, you know, 20 years ago. I just wouldn't have. So a lot of it's down to that. Also, I have got a kind of minimum day rate that I decided, and it's not loads of money at all, but I decided I needed to stick to that. And I won't work for below that because I don't think it's fair to work for below that given the experience I've got now. And also a lot of budgets are so difficult because there's this kind of dance that you almost do, you know. I mean, I quite like it if a client says to me, this is the budget, do you want to do it? Because quite often they'll say, can you send a quote? And then you have to spend a long time putting together a quote that's very comprehensive and covering all these different areas and usage and all this kind of stuff. And then they'll come back and, you know, they might say, oh, that's a bit more than we were thinking. So then you're like, well, what were you thinking? And then they really go opaque about it. So, you know, it's this constant kind of negotiation. And I guess that's where an agent is very helpful, a commercial agent, because they deal with all of that. Whereas obviously if you don't have a commercial agent, you're having to deal with it all yourself. And there's the issue of copyright and, you know, it can get quite complicated. But I feel quite good about having now a day rate and a half day rate, and I don't really budge on that. And as I said, you know, I can be flexible, of course, and it certainly isn't loads of money. But I was just sick of, I felt in the end that I was being taken a bit advantage of in terms of what budgets, perceived budgets, and what I was charging, and that I was going way kind of above and beyond for these jobs, and it just wasn't fair. The pay I was getting just wasn't fair. So I was kind of felt that I needed to stand up for myself a bit more in that sense.
Yeah, I think it's so important as well, because if you have personal projects that you want to pursue, you can very easily end up consuming all of your time trying to please somebody else. So I think it's important to have those filters in place. Have you ever found, and this could be commercial or personal actually, have you ever found yourself in a situation on a shoot where circumstances outside of your control could affect the outcome of your work? And if so, how did you problem solve and manage that situation to ensure the quality of your work wasn't affected?
I mean, it depends whether you're location-wise. It's nearly always weather-related, and studio-wise, it's nearly always person-related. So, of course, there's been shoots that I've kind of gone to do, and the light's appalling, the weather's appalling, and I feel particularly when I was working kind of on my own, particularly when I was doing a lot of the Time Out travel guides, for instance, I'd get a huge long list to work through, and you were constantly problem solving because you were constantly up against these kind of these barriers and these difficulties that you had to overcome in order to get the shot. And of course the picture editor isn't really very sympathetic to that because they just want the shot. So I remember I had to do, it wasn't very exciting one because I'd done lots of the guides to, I'd done like Miami and DC and Naples and Barcelona and all Copenhagen. And then I got given the Bristol one. Bristol and the southwest of England or something. And this was all shot at that point on 35mm slide film as well, like transparency. So it was I think this was pre-digital. And the picture editor at the time kind of got back to me and said, I have to say I'm really disappointed because the images, there's just a lot of grey sky there. And I was like, well, there is. But, you said the images had to be shot on these, within this time frame. And the weather has been terrible and there's nothing I can do about that. But, of course, there were ways that I would work around it. So, for instance, if I had to shoot a restaurant and it was really grey, gloomy skies, I wouldn't do an exterior shot. I'd go inside and try and get, like a waiter to walk through the shot or the kitchen to make something up for me or, so there was kind of problem solving in that sense. And I just think you've got to try not to panic. I mean, in terms with dealing with different personalities, that can be challenging on shoots because I find it particularly difficult actually on commercial shoots because if you're working with models like I did a shoot recently with kids and, kids are unpredictable, of course, like understandably, I get it. But you're trying to do what you can in a set time frame. You're aware that the studio's only booked for a number of hours. The client's there looking, you're kind of downloading as you're going along. And if a kid has a total meltdown on set, what do you do? I mean, I hope I'm quite good with people and I manage to stay quite calm and try and work through the problem. I mean, often the problem is really about talking to the client. And also what you don't want is just kind of suddenly cause this panic on the set where the client's panicking because they are paying a lot of money for the shoot and they're not getting what they need. The kid's having a meltdown, their mum's freaking out because they feel that their children are looking like they're really badly behaved children. So I think a lot of it is kind of just managing personalities and just really staying calm. I mean, I haven't got to the stage where I've kind of had to leave and start meditating for half an hour or anything, but a lot of it is just thinking, okay, what can we do to resolve this and how can we work through this and keep everyone happy? But I think a lot of photography is about problem solving, even if it's depending on the right equipment for the job or, you're making decisions all the time. And you have to be confident in those decisions, I think. And I think, again, as I keep going back to confidence, that's something that comes with experience and with confidence. So, yeah, I've been in some situations that have been challenging, but I think with a bit of kind of common sense and creativity as well, I've managed to come to some kind of solution with those.
Let's step away from your commercial work for a moment and take a look at your journey towards Ex Voto. And in particular, I wanted to discuss some of the smaller projects, the stepping stones, if you like, that took you there. For example, Ryan and Alfie or College on the Hill. Where did these ideas come from?
It's hard to say. I mean, I remember College on the Hill, for instance, came because I'd actually been sent, I think, for an editorial job to photograph. It wasn't very exciting, an event that was happening at the school. And this is a school for blind, mostly kids who are blind or they're very much visually impaired. And so the job was not related to the experience of the children at this school at all. But I remember being there and I thought, what an interesting place, what an interesting environment. And there were these kids who had no sight at all doing these amazing things like cooking lessons and making cups of tea and doing maths lessons, but using, counters and bits of string and doing science lessons. So it was in lots of ways, it was a working school, but nearly all the children had very little or zero, sight. So I was sent for a kind of commercial job, but I thought, well, this would be a really interesting project. So I remember when I was there, I ended up talking to the head. And I think I also said, I'd love to pursue this as a personal project, but I could also, give you some images if you wanted to use them for publicity or prospectus purposes. And they were quite open to that. But that's a real example of me not really pushing forward a personal project when I wish I had. So really up until my big project, Ex Voto, I was like dipping into all these personal projects. And the ideas, so for that one, it just came from, I'd been sent there already. But other projects, I get a lot of inspiration from literature and film, and I'm always writing down like notes in a sketchbook or in my little notebook. So I've got hundreds of ideas all the time, and often it's a small, simple idea, but it can lead to something much more. And with Ryan and Alfie, I did this series. It was actually part of the MA I did in anthropology, but we had to do a kind of practical. There was a practical component to the MA. And we had to, I think it was just the simple brief was to tell a story about a kind of urban environment. And I was struggling a bit to come up with an idea. And then I remembered these reservoirs up in Walthamstow, Tottenham, around there, and started to explore those. And I came across these two boys called Ryan and Alfie, who just, as you will see if you watch the video, love fishing. They're obsessed with fishing, but they were these great personalities. And actually Alfie, who had left school when he was 15 or something, came up with these really kind of poetic lines. So I ended up just hanging out with them for a few days. It's hard to say where my ideas come from. Often they're sparked by, like with Ex Voto, it was sparked by watching a film. I mean, I came up with an idea recently that was from a poem I'd read. Not that I sit around reading loads of poetry, but I'd kind of stumbled across it. Sometimes it's from a character in literature. But I try not to, I mean, I think some people kind of think, I've got to really, it doesn't ever come, ideas never come for personal projects when you're trying to come up with an idea, if that makes sense. You
when you're searching for one, so to speak.
When you're searching for an idea, you'll probably come up with nothing, and it'll be very frustrating. But I suppose it just comes from being observant and interested in life and what's around me, and being curious as a person. So, but getting back to your original question, it wasn't really until 5 years ago when I was becoming frustrated with the fact that I wasn't really committing to a personal project that I thought things have to change, because I was becoming a bit complacent about commercial work. I wasn't enjoying it so much. And I had all these kind of personal projects that I started, but I'd never really got closure on them because I hadn't really committed to them fully. And I thought, I'm at the stage of my career now where I have to make a kind of conscious decision that if I want to be pursuing personal projects, and if these are the projects that are most meaningful to me, then they have to come first. And whether that means I miss out on commercial work, or I don't go on holiday, or I don't see my friends as much, I did have to make sacrifices, but it was also a very definite decision that I made at that point in my career. So before, I'd always had ideas, loads of ideas, and I'd started personal projects, but they'd never really, not that they hadn't gone anywhere, but I'd never fully committed to them in the way that I have with the Ex Voto project.
I guess you say they potentially didn't go somewhere, but they all acted as stepping stones. When you set off on the journey for Ex Voto, did you start with the end in mind? Did you have a goal that you wanted to achieve from it?
I don't really have a goal, because I always see it as an exploration. So, I mean, yes, I thought when I started, it'd be, amazing if I could have a really beautiful book of this work. But then for the first 3 years, I was taking images I just didn't like, that weren't meaningful to me, that weren't saying anything particularly profound, that weren't really communicating what I felt when I was in these places of pilgrimage, because the project is all about, it's 3 pilgrimage sites, Christian pilgrimage sites in Europe. So I didn't really know, I never really know where a project's going to go. And I think it's quite dangerous to have these very set goals in sight, in terms of, right, in a year's time, I want to have a book out and I want it to have an exhibition of my work, because it can take, that project took me 5 years. Other photographers work on projects that take them 20 years. And I think it distracts from the actual reason you're making the work if you're already thinking about the final outcome.
One of the things that really struck me when I started looking at your work was that when you were doing your MA, you observed rather than taking photographs, which I thought was really interesting. Is that something, was that kind of like a light bulb moment, or is that something you'd done in the past on other projects? Had you stopped to look at the big picture before shooting it? Because there's a tendency, particularly if you go somewhere and you visit and you want to take photographs, the danger is that you just snap away or for the whole trip, whereas sometimes taking a moment to stop and look at the big picture can answer all the questions for you and make it easier. Is that something that you'd done on other projects? Had you taken time to explore them visually before capturing them?
I think I'd explored them in terms of research. So I'll always look at other projects that might have, similar kind of themes. For instance, Ex Voto, like, I am not the first person to photograph Lourdes by any means. Hundreds, if not thousands, of photographers have photographed Lourdes before, and pilgrimage is a huge kind of topic, actually, particularly at the moment in terms of photography. It's been very widely covered. But I think what was different about X-Photo was that because I'd committed to it in a different way, I wasn't in a hurry and I wasn't in a rush. So whereas when I was doing, for instance, I did a project about kids in alternative communities, which I really enjoyed working on, but because I was 90% of my work was commercial in terms of my time, I was trying to fit in this personal project into 10% or less of my time. So I would be going to these communities, only staying for like a couple of days, and then having to disappear to do a job in London. And of course, I didn't get to know them with that in terms of that much depth, or really, I wasn't really able to spend my time just sitting and thinking and looking and observing, because I was under this kind of time. I was in this time frame, and I only had a certain short amount of time to kind of get what I needed, if you like. So I didn't have the luxury of being able to sit around and think and look, and that felt very different. I mean, also because I actually decided to do an MA in anthropology rather than photography. And I did my dissertation about look, which of course required a lot of observation and looking and thinking and writing and reading about theory of pilgrimage, and it just slowed everything down. But also a big kind of turning point for me in that project was also moving to a large format camera, which for me completely changed the way I worked, the way I connected with the people I photographed. It's such a much more considered and slow and kind of quite meditative way of working. So it was really a combination of things. But I felt like, feel like I wasn't in a hurry with that project, and I knew if I wanted to do it well, it would probably take me several years, which it did.
And of course, that whole 5 years of work led you to winning the Sony Award in 2018.
Yes.
There's a lot of awards out there at the moment. Are there some that you feel can progress a photographer's career more than others?
Oh, definitely. Yeah, I mean, I've entered quite a few competitions over the years. I mean, undoubtedly, the Sony Award and the Photographer of the Year Award, it's changed my life, and it's changed my career trajectory, certainly, in terms of the kind of publicity that came with it, the exposure that came with it, the money. You know, I mean, suddenly I didn't suddenly have like loads of money, but it actually managed to reimburse me for a lot of the money that I'd put in myself when I was making this work. So that was really, really helpful. But I'm quite careful about competitions and awards, because I think some of them are fantastic. Like the Sony's great; it's free to enter. They generally have a strong jury and strong judges. It's a very fair process. It's internationally open to entrance internationally, and you get a lot out of it if you win. Definitely, there are other. I don't know if I should mention the other ones, but there are others that I really don't admire at all. That, for instance, you have to pay quite a hefty fee to enter, and the result, or the kind of winners, if you like, what they get is exposure. Well, they claim you get exposure, which is often very limited. And I don't think, because they run so many competitions and they have so many winners, it's like rolling competitions, that actually people get much out of it. So I tend to avoid those ones. I mean, obviously competitions like the World Press Awards are still very highly regarded. The Taylor Wessing at the National Portrait Gallery is pretty highly regarded. But again, I mean, I have a problem with that, because I think it's something like £40 per print. And, you know, you haven't got much of a chance of getting in, really, but purely down to the number of entries they have. So I'm quite careful in terms of I look carefully at the judges and make sure that I really respect the kind of judges or the jury. But I also look at what you actually get if you do win, and also what the entry fee is, if anything, and kind of it's about weighing it up. Like, is it worth it? Because I think a lot of competitions, it is down to luck. Like, I don't think I necessarily would have won the Sony if I'd entered this year or last year. I don't know, but I think I probably wouldn't have. So, you know, it's not just about the best work, and how do you even define the best work when there's such a breadth of work out there, and there's so many categories and so many styles. So, I mean, in some ways I think I was lucky, but that was a project I worked really, really, really hard on. So, and I really dedicated myself to that project. So in some ways I do think I was lucky, but in other ways I feel that really committing to that project paid off. So yeah, I feel quite mixed about competitions. They've undoubtedly been brilliant for me, but I also think for photographers it can be really difficult for like photographers' self-esteem and confidence if you don't want, no one wants to get reject after reject, and that can happen quite easily. And then you've ended up spending several £100s in a year on competitions and not got anywhere, and actually would often be better to focus that time and money on making new work. But of course, in terms of exposure, it can be amazing, and the Sony was fantastic for me in terms of that.
Had you entered any work into the Sony Awards previously?
No, so I'd never entered the Sony Awards before, partly because I saw it as quite kind of a bit more commercial and a bit industry. When they first started, I can't remember when it was, maybe 12 years ago, I can't remember the date, maybe 10 years ago, they had this, it was a huge fancy event at Cannes in the south of France, a kind of huge red carpet event, and a photographer actually who I very much admire called Vanessa Winship won the, I think, professional category for the first year. And then it seemed to go quite commercial. I felt like I kept seeing the same type of photography cropping up every year, and I didn't feel that my work really fitted into any of the categories, because a lot of the categories were quite they were quite strong in terms of the categorization, and quite so like environment, sport, documentary. There wasn't much kind of room to go beyond those categories. So the reason I entered the Sony in 2018 was because I was on their mailing list or whatever, but I got an email saying that they had a new category called the Discovery Award, which seemed much more open, and it was about, unearthing the things that might remain hidden otherwise. I mean, it was quite broad, but I suddenly thought actually that was a category that my work could fit into. And you just had to, it was a very easy process. You had to just send 10 JPEGs and a statement, and it was free. So I kind of entered it without really thinking any more of it. But it was also that I noticed that the jury had shifted. So actually in my year, it had gone more towards there was more of an art representation in terms of the jury, like curators and people from galleries. So it felt like it was turning into a slightly different type of award. They still had all the other categories, but they were expanding a little bit in terms of the kind of work that they were encouraging people to submit, I suppose.
Is there another award out there that is on your radar that you'd like to win? I know that is a very, very broad question, but...
Well, I would love to one day be nominated for Deutsche Börse, which is the award at the Photographers Gallery, where they have 4 photographers, which is every year, I believe, which is a pretty big award in the kind of art world. And, they have a lot of really interesting work, actually. That's on at the moment, although obviously it's shut because of the pandemic. But that is an award that I would love to perhaps one day be a part of. I mean, a lot of the artists in that are probably a bit older than me, actually. They've been around a bit longer, and you have to be nominated. The problem is with some of these awards, it's one of those catch-22 situations, because some of the more prestigious awards, you have to be nominated, so you can't just submit. So immediately you have to have reached a certain kind of level in terms of the photography world. But what I have found is that definitely, like, having won the Sony, one thing can lead to the next, and people start to know about you and recognize your work, and that can then lead to the nominations that you need in order to win certain awards. But I'm not really, it's difficult to say, because I'm not really that bothered about awards. But of course, if it allows me again to kind of make the work I really want to make, and the work that's really important to me, whether that's through exposure or getting residencies, or it's through prize money and being, financially compensated, then that's fantastic.
We've not really touched on the current situation. So for anyone listening, some context, we're in week 12, if I'm not mistaken.
I think so. I've kind of lost track.
12, 13?
Yeah.
No
maybe
idea.
13, I think.
I think it is potentially 13 of the coronavirus lockdown. How have you adapted to it? How have you found it? From a work perspective, I mean.
Yeah. Well, I mean, I haven't got any work, and most photographers I know, all the commissions are on hold. There are a couple of photographers I know who are kind of still life, mostly still life photographers who have got little studio setups at home, who have been able to do, product shots or still life shots for clients. I'm starting, I think, because the lockdown rather is easing very slightly now, that things are kind of gearing back up again. So I did have an inquiry about a potential job, but most photographers I know are extremely quiet, and I suppose it's thinking about how to try and be productive in this time, but without putting a huge amount of pressure on yourself as well. And that's partly why I've kind of stepped away from doing a direct project about COVID, if you like. So, and some photographers are managing to make really interesting work, I think, and do it very, very well. And I think some other photographers are finding different avenues for their work, or they're experimenting with photography in ways that they hadn't before. But I mean, I spent the first 3 or 4 weeks feeling completely uninspired in terms of making work, but was trying to use the time to catch up on, reading and films that I've wanted to watch for ages. And in some ways, I actually quite enjoyed the kind of slower and simpler life that lockdown has enforced, if you like. I mean, obviously, it's completely tragic in terms of the number of deaths, and thankfully, no one I know has been affected really badly. But once you kind of go beyond that and look at your own way of living, I do think it's obviously a time for reflection and perhaps rethinking things. But it's hard. I mean, financially, of course, it's hard because no one's really earning, and the government are helping to a certain degree, but no one is working in the way that they were 4 months ago. And no one knows also when things are going to start up again. So that uncertainty is very difficult.
Do you have a photography motto that you work by? And by that I mean, so for example, and it sounds really cheesy, but I always like to think capturing little moments that make a big difference. And it's kind of what I was saying earlier, if you see a moment in life and you capture it, it's there forever, and if you don't, it's gone. Do you have anything that you kind of work by, so to speak?
I suppose, I mean, I think for me, photography, a lot of it's about rediscovering like common things that we see every day, but that can quite often be overlooked, or that we don't always really take the time to look at closely. And whether that is, I mean, it can be anything, but I'm just thinking about my personal projects. Like, a lot of my personal projects have been about people who actually live in lots of ways very quiet and unremarkable lives, but to me they're very fascinating in terms of their beliefs, or the way they choose to live their lives and the decisions they make. So I mean, I suppose it's a bit of a cliche saying the beauty in the everyday, because it feels like every photographer says that, but for me it's about looking that bit harder, I think. And actually I've noticed that recently, particularly in lockdown, because I think it felt so kind of freeing just to go out for the daily exercise, for instance. This was a few weeks ago, that I was just noticing things, even in my neighbourhood, and I've lived here for a really long time, and I'm very comfortable in this neighbourhood, and I feel very familiar in this neighbourhood. But I feel like I was just looking more and observing more, and I wasn't kind of on my phone thinking, oh God, where have I got to go to next, and I'm late, and I better text my friend and tell her I'm late, and I've got this and that. And it was quite interesting that there was this kind of shift in thinking, I think. So yeah, I think a lot of my personal work it's not about grand ideas, and it's not about going and photographing these kind of people living these extreme lives. It's often about very ordinary people, if you like, or people who would otherwise be kind of overseen, but whose lives I find fascinating in some way. So yeah, don't know if that really answers your questions. It's not a motto exactly, but I think it also connects to me being very much an observer and a looker and a thinker as well. So they all kind of connect together.
You mentioned something then about simplicity, and we didn't really touch on it earlier, but where did the idea for the swimming pools come from?
Ah, yeah.
Because when you look at that work, I suddenly thought, I just looked at it, and we've all seen empty swimming pools, and I'd never thought to photograph them. And you obviously found something in there which sparked your imagination. Do you remember what it was? Do you remember the seed?
I remember very clearly. So the first one I took was many years ago now, and I was on like a road trip in America, and I remember stopping off at a kind of motel in California. Very average, there's a lot of these motels on the roadside. Didn't really have that much of a plan, but had brought my camera with me because it was quite a big trip. And kind of venturing out at night, and it was quite a cold evening, although the day had been warm, and there was this swimming pool, because a lot of the motels obviously have outdoor pools, kind of with this forest in the background. And because it was a cold evening and the pool was heated, you had this steam kind of rising from the pool, and there was this picket fence around it, and it just felt like I kind of walked onto the set of a David Lynch film or something. So it was quite surreal, quite sinister in a way, very kind of cinematic, if you like. And I took an image, and obviously I'd taken it's all shot on film, but I'd taken loads of rolls of film over the course of 3 weeks or however long I was away. But there was just something about the atmosphere there. And quite often, actually, I feel with my photography, it relates to how I feel when I'm in that place. So I felt a kind of slight uneasiness, but I also felt that this was visually something quite special that I wanted to try and capture on film. And then that led, when I got all the photos back, I remember that being the kind of standout image from the whole trip. You know, I'd taken other ones of like roadside diners, you know, classic kind of Americana road trip photographs, but it was that image that just stood out to me, and that was when I decided to make a longer series, which was swimming pools at night, empty, not of water but of people, because they take on a very different meaning. And I think quite often, you know, particularly motel pools, you often associate them with, you know, warm summer evenings and kids diving in and lots of noise, and this was the opposite. It was late at night, there was not a person in sight. And I think with the landscape kind of framing it as well, it felt a bit like it was potentially out of a kind of horror film or something, but it just had this very distinct atmosphere that is quite hard to describe, actually, but that I think I was able to capture on film.
You mentioned earlier that you know your equipment extremely well. You don't potentially maybe use a huge amount, but you know it extremely well. Is there an item that you couldn't live without in your kit bag? Something that goes everywhere with you? Apart from the obvious, obviously.
Probably my light meter. I still use a light meter. And I still use a light meter. I look like a loon. I still use a light meter a lot with digital as well. If I'm using flash, for instance, and digital camera, I will meter it with a light meter. And that goes back to me just, learning on film. And particularly when I'm using my large format camera, you know, there's no built-in light meter or anything. It's completely mechanical. There's no battery or anything. So I'm very reliant on my light meter. I have now got a light meter app on my phone, but I don't find it that easy to use. So I've just got a very basic old light meter that I actually bought when I was at St Martin's about 20 plus years ago. That's the most basic light meter going. I think it's not a fancy one, but that's always with me, even when I move it between my digital kit. Because I've got a kind of wheelie suitcase for my digital kit, and then I've got a wheelie suitcase for my large format camera, and I move it between the two. So that's probably, in terms of equipment, the thing that I always have, I suppose. If
someone had £50 to spend to improve their photography, how would you advise they spend it?
I'm not sure if it would improve their photography, but I think to inspire them to really think about their photography, I would probably say, well, depends where they live. Let's say they live in London. I would say go to 5 different exhibitions, and it doesn't just have to be photography. Go and see a painting show at the Tate. Go to the Whitechapel Gallery. Go to the National Portrait Gallery. That's free anyway. So go to as many exhibitions as you can. Use the money for the entry fee, and then buy the catalogue of the exhibition that you most love and keep that forever, because you will go back to it. But yeah, I find I don't go to as many shows as I would like to, but I mean, I've got a huge kind of library of photography books that I'm dipping into all the time. And I think it's really important to get your influences not just from other photographers, but from painters or sculptors or, you know, all types of different artists, films and literature and poetry. So I would say, yeah, go through the kind of listings and find, 5 or 6 exhibitions that are on, and spend a couple of days going to all of those, and then bring something away from it. So bring the catalogue away.
Oh, yeah, that's a brilliant answer. I think it would certainly improve probably your lifestyle and your photography. Oh. I've asked this question a few times, and I'm not entirely sure it's the right question, which is, what's the ultimate goal for you? But it could also be asked, how would you like your work and you to be remembered as a photographer? I guess they're one in the same and they're slightly different at the same time.
I think I would like my work to leave some of impact in terms of it. I mean, I would like my work to have some longevity. I hope that people see that when particularly with Ex Voto, for instance, that, you know, it's a very sensitive body of work and there's a kind of stillness and a quietness there that's really, really important to me. And I think that's how I work best, actually. So if people can, I don't know, kind of look at my work and get some sense of almost calm or serenity, or it makes them think about their own beliefs or their own faith. And this is bearing in mind that I came into this project as a completely, well, I still am, like I don't feel I am a religious person, and I would probably class myself as an atheist. So doing a project about faith wasn't something that was, you know, a kind of obvious direction for me. But I think if people can connect with my work in some way, whether that's on a spiritual level or in terms of them feeling something when they look at my work and it bringing some emotion to them, or just making them think and stop and think, then that to me is doing something quite meaningful. I did get this really amazing email, actually. Don't know if I can remember it exactly, but there was a guy who wrote to me after he'd seen some of the pictures I'd taken from the Ex Voto series in Lourdes, and he wrote to me saying that he had polio and he'd been taken to Lourdes as a really, really young boy, and that the trip had stayed with him. But he said, actually, by the way, I didn't get better, because Lourdes is known as a place of great kind of spiritual but also physical healing, and there are these tales, or there are some of them have been proved, but there are of this miraculous healing and that kind of thing. So you'll see a lot of very ill and very sick people in Lourdes. That's, if you like, what it's known for. And he'd been taken as a young child with polio, and he said, it didn't make me better, by the way. He said, but what does make you better is art. Art makes me better. And I just thought that was really, and he said, work like yours makes me better. And he didn't mean better in that he's going to suddenly, you know, leap up and be cured and run a marathon, but he meant that in terms of his mental health and his spiritual health, and that it gave him something, and whether that something is a bit of hope or some sympathy or some joy, or, you know, whatever it is, if my work can elicit that kind of reaction in some people, then that to me is something really, really meaningful.
I think that's maybe the most wonderful compliment you could have for your work, really. Yeah.
No, absolutely. I was, when I got that email, it kind of popped up into my inbox, and I was like, wow. Yeah, that was really amazing to get that.
Yeah, I can imagine. Do you have any future projects that you'd like to explore? I know you have Vera, the film, which, if I'm not mistaken, you were planning to release later this year. Is that correct?
Yeah, realistically, I think it's going to be next year now, because I was supposed to be back in Belarus filming now. So obviously that's been postponed. But yeah, I'm making a film about Vera, who is a very unorthodox nun, who is one of the main protagonists, if you like, or main characters in the Ex Voto series. And I met her at a pilgrimage site in Poland called Grabarka. And I've now been to stay at her convent 4 times, and she's this very extraordinary woman. So I'm working on that. And yeah, I'm working with a close friend and kind of co-director called Mary Cecile, who also accompanied me on a lot of the Ex Voto work. So it feels very much like a collaboration. But Vera is a difficult character. Like, she's intriguing and she's enigmatic, but she's really complex, and she'll kind of give you so much and then she'll retreat from you. So it's like you're in this quite difficult situation, and you're trying to figure out what you can ask her to do or what isn't, you know, what you don't ask her to do. But also, we're there in this kind of monastic convent in Belarus, thinking, you know, it's like it's odd when you go there, because it's the antithesis of everything really about my life, my everyday life in London, immersed in these rituals and these prayers. So yeah, I mean, we're working on the film, which is now likely to be, it will be out next year, but we need to finish that. So that's taking up a lot of time, because filmmaking as well is something that is quite new to me. And of course, I mean, a photography project can take years, but with the filmmaking, you've not just got the actual shooting of it, you've got the editing, which is huge, and then creating these soundscapes and then the grading and all the post-production. So it feels like an even more mammoth task, I guess, than photography. But I mean, I'm really loving it, and a lot of the film is actually very photographic in style anyway. So lots of very, very still shots that look like they're photographs, but obviously that it's moving image. And Vera is a difficult and complex character, but I think a lot of the most interesting people are. So that's been taking up a lot of time. And then I also had started a project in Italy just before kind of the pandemic and lockdown and everything. So I'm hoping to go back in the autumn, but that very much depends on what's going on in terms of travel and health and everything. But I would like to continue that, and that is really looking at belonging and identity and loss and faith, again comparing the north of Italy to the south, like Sicily and Sardinia. So I've gone on a couple of trips, but this I also feel could be quite an epic project, so it may not be finished for years and years yet. Yeah,
it sounds a bit daft, and it kind of wasn't on my list of kind of things to explore, but how do you know when a project like that is concluded?
Well, for Ex Voto, I got to the stage where I knew I was having a book coming out, and I knew when it was going to go to press.
I see.
So I had a deadline. I had a deadline for those images. But I feel with this one and with future projects, I feel like it's when you start becoming a bit tired of it that you kind of question your motivations. Because for me, a personal project particularly, it's exploring, and it's about discovery, and it's about this kind of sense of wonder you get when you're making these images. And sometimes it can be really stressful and it can be quite difficult and challenging, but I'm always so excited to be there making that work, and I'm always so excited about getting the film back. And I think once you lose that, and you lose that kind of enthusiasm and spontaneity, it's probably time to move on. I mean, I think some projects take a long time, like Ex Voto. I didn't get any images I liked for 3 years, but something kept drawing me back to that project. And I think it's quite hard when you've committed a lot to something and you've spent a lot of time and energy and kind of emotional energy to then just walk away from a project. But for me, it's quite good. Yeah, I mean, Ex Voto, I knew I had a publisher and I had the book coming out, so that was a deadline that I had to stick to. So that was quite helpful for me in terms of the images had to all be scanned and ready to go at this date. So it wasn't possible then to take any more. But yeah, I think if you become kind of tired of something and a bit fatigued with an idea, it's probably time to either, put it to one side and get some space and get some perspective, or think, okay, sometimes you have to accept maybe it's never going to work. But I think it's important to not see that as a failure as well, and to kind of learn from that and then build on that for any work after that.
Do you remember the first image of Ex Voto where you looked and thought, bingo, that's it?
Yeah, I remember it very clearly.
We're jackpot. We're on the right track.
Oh, absolutely, yeah. Because for the first 3 years, all the images I'd taken were on colour film, on medium format, and they were kind of images that would have been nice in a magazine, nice editorial images. They were perfectly competent. There were some nice images. There was nothing bad about them, but they didn't have this mystery or this intrigue or this feeling of kind of otherworldliness that I really wanted to capture. There was definitely something missing there for me. And it was only when I went back and I completely changed my approach and I shot everything in black and white on the large format camera. And I remember getting those contacts back. And it's not like every image wasn't amazing, of course, but I got them back and I was really excited. And I sent some pictures on WhatsApp to my assistant, Mary Cecile, who had accompanied me on the trips. And I remember her just texting back and going, oh my God, finally we've cracked it. Because we'd probably been to Lourdes 8 times at this point, and I hadn't ever really got any images I was happy with. And yeah, that did feel like a kind of breakthrough moment in the work, definitely. But it had taken it not working and almost getting it wrong and working through that and doing an MA for 2 years and writing my dissertation about Lourdes. So it was a kind of coming together of all these different things, really, I think, that allowed me to then open myself up to a new way of working and a different direction.
Do you have any of your own images framed in your personal space, like your home or your
Yeah,
studio?
I've got one here, but most of the images I've got framed are ones that have been in exhibitions, for instance. So they're not ones that I've gone out. They're ones that I've needed to frame for an exhibition, and then I've got them back at home. I've got a lot of my images framed, but they're stacked in my studio that I have. But yeah, I've got 2 swimming pools and someone from my alternative communities project in my flat. So I'm not surrounded by my own work. I think I would find that a bit much. I have a lot of work from other photographers, and I quite often do print swaps with friends, which is a really nice way of sharing our work. So I've actually got quite a few of my friends, I've got their work framed in my flat as well. So I've got quite a nice collection there. So yeah, I do have the odd one, but only 3, I think.
Yeah, I didn't are you sat constantly just staring at your walls thinking, wow, I am
like
good.
What
What is it about those? You said some of them have been framed for exhibitions, which is why they're on the wall. Is there any that haven't been framed for an exhibition that you particularly like, and why? Like, why have you chosen to put that?
What I do have, actually. So the others, I've got 2 swimming pools that were from an exhibition, and a portrait of a young girl from an alternative community in Sussex, a kind of really sweet, like hippie-ish young girl. They're framed, they were in exhibitions. And when I did my ex-voto project and I did the book, it had been 5 years of such a hard kind of slog. Like I loved it. I absolutely thrived off that project. I loved making that work. But there were times when it was just so hard and so difficult, and times when I thought I was just going to give up with it altogether. And when I actually went on press in terms of the book, which was a litho, like an old, traditional print press in Italy, to actually see those pages coming out of the machine, it was such a thrill to see your work finally properly in print, in a beautiful book, on the paper you wanted, on the stock you wanted, in this old kind of printing factory. And you had to sign off. I'd never been on print before in this way, and I had to sign off every kind of sheet, every page that they printed out. But what they did was, which is what happens, is because they have these big plates, so they make up these big plates, and actually a lot of the plates have got several images on. And I've kept one of the proofs that they did, which is pretty big. It's probably like 40 inches by 30, maybe bigger than that, in fact. So it's got loads of the images from the book, but some of them are kind of upside down or on the side, because it's how they when they go to press, how they lay it out. And I've actually got that framed, and it says on the bottom the paper type, and it's got where it was printed, and it's just a really nice reminder of the book itself. So I've got that framed, which has got it's got about 15 images, which are plates from the book at slightly different angles, all on one big sheet of like creamy thick photo paper. So I have got that framed.
Oh wow! So you were actually there watching it being printed?
Yeah, it was really exciting.
Wow!
Yeah.
I've always wondered how that happens, because you see it on TV programs, and a box arrives in the house, and the person opens it, and there's their book. It hadn't even dawned on me that you would have to sign off on it. Mm-hmm. That must have been incredible.
The publishers were called Goss Books, and they're very experienced, so they would have done a great job had they been there just on their own. But often they work with the photographer, and the photographer, it's very usual for the photographer to accompany them on press, because there are very small tweaks that you can make. So each plate has to be approved. So for instance, if there's one image that you feel is too dark, they'll then make a slight adjustment and reprint it. And I felt, given the amount of work that I put into the project, that I really kind of needed to be there to check it was all okay. But also, it was really exciting seeing each page go through the printing press, and then they just laid out flat, so you have these huge piles of thousands and thousands of sheets before it gets bound. It's on a kind of industrial estate outside of, where was it, Verona. So it's not kind of the prettiest, but we had a really nice Italian lunch. That was nice. It felt like kind of closure for the project, but I felt really kind of proud being there, because you feel like it's 5 years of work on this printing press, and to see them like sheet after sheet after sheet, and the sounds of the machines, and it was great. I really loved being on press. And it also meant that I knew that the book had the look and the feel that I really wanted, and I wasn't waiting for that moment when it, there was also when you get the boxes of books and you open them, and of course that's when you see it all properly together. But I love being on press. It was great. Yeah. If I have another book, I'd like to go on press again.
Yeah, I can imagine. I bet it's fantastic.
Mm-hmm.
All right, I'm going to try a few quick fire questions for no other reason than I'm just interested to see what your gut reaction is.
Okay.
So, film or digital?
Gotta go film.
Yeah.
I just love work. I'd be really sad if I couldn't work on film. The anticipation and the excitement, and I'm just much more careful when I work on film. So I would say film.
Colour or black and white?
So I think I go through phases, but at the moment I'm very much in a black and white phase, and that's partly photographers who I've kind of rediscovered who I really love, like August Sander and Vanessa Winship and Judith Joy Ross and Mary Ellen Mark, and a lot of these photographers who always worked in black and white. So there's a timelessness to black and white that I'm really loving at the moment.
People or landscapes?
That's difficult because landscapes, I love being lost in landscapes, and you can really, really take your time and it can feel very calming, I think. But ultimately, the pictures I'm most excited about getting back are always portraits. And I think that's really controversial to say. I think it's harder to take a good portrait than it is to take a good landscape. But I kind of think that with the way I work anyway, with the way I work and with that camera I use, I think it's more challenging to take a really strong portrait than it is to take a really strong landscape. So I would go for portrait, and because you're always trying to just tap into that thing that's kind of intangible with the portrait, just trying to get an essence of that person in one or two shots. Because also using that camera, I only ever take one or two plates, so I haven't got many chances, if you like, partly because it's so expensive. But yeah, I would go portrait.
We didn't really touch on your work in New York because I know you discussed it in previous podcasts, but where you are now in your career, if you could give one piece of advice to that young 19, 20-year-old that arrived in New York, what would it be?
I would just say, just keep going and keep looking and keep learning, because I think a lot of what I do is just, it's not these kind of big statements. It's just come from being a curious person. And I think as long as I'm interested in learning, whether that's through photography or through books or through film, that's what kind of keeps me going. So I would say, yeah, keep going and don't give up and follow the thing that most interests you. Just keep pursuing that.
I think that is a very wonderful way to conclude our conversation. Alys Tomlinson, thank you so much.
Thank you very much for having me.
Absolute pleasure. Now, if people want to find you and your work, where can they go? Where can they find you?
So I've got my website, which is alystomlinson.co.uk, spelled ALYS, which is the Welsh spelling. And I've got my gallery is called Hacklebury Fine Art, and my book is called Ex Voto. And I think there's quite a lot of online presence for all that stuff, so it shouldn't be too hard to find. Images of pilgrims, probably, if you Google my name, I think that's what comes up probably. But yeah, I've got and the Sony Awards as well. In fact, I think the new winner they announced today. But if you look up the Sony, then everything's archived, so you can see the previous winners on the World Photography Organisation site as well.
That was my conversation with the wonderful Alys Tomlinson. Thank you to Alys for taking the time to come on the show. And as always, I hope you enjoyed listening to her as much as I enjoyed speaking with her. If you enjoy the show and you like what we do, please leave a review. It takes less than 30 seconds on Apple Podcasts, but it really helps to secure world-class photographers who have very busy schedules. With that in mind, thank you this week to MCav80, who said there's a number of photography podcasts out there now, but I've yet to find one that delivers inspiring, actionable content. The long-form interviews offer deep insights into each photographer's work. The host, Matthew, has a unique skill for giving his guests the freedom to open up whilst engaging with his audience. 5 stars, exclamation mark. You've got a listener for life. MCAV80. Goodness me, a check is in the post. Thank you very much indeed. If there's anything that sparked your interest during our conversation, visit thestandoutcompany.com/podcast, where you'll find links from the episode along with the show notes. For now, thank you as always for tuning in. I've been Matthew Walker, she has been Alys Tomlinson, and you have been sensational. Until next time, take care.